are going to go down proportionally.
Is it absolutely 24%?
No, I mean, again, in physiology, the way we do things is we look at what is the average change that happens when we do experiments. But in biology, there's always a certain amount of biological variation. And so there's always going to be something like a 2 to 4% variation that you're going to see around these numbers. But when we speak about something, we speak in terms of the average change that is occurring.
So is a 24% reduction significant in the case of Mr. Floyd?
Yes, it's extremely important because, again, because of the factors that we're dealing with. We're seeing here that with the reduction in the ELV from the prone, we're decreasing the oxygen reserves. We're also affecting the size of the opening of the hypopharynx, because as the ELV goes down, you're getting a proportional reduction in the size of that. And in addition, when you're turned prone like this, your work of breathing goes up because the stiffness of your lungs changes and the stiffness of your chest wall changes. So the person has to do more effort to breathe in that position.
So the hypopharynx is linked to the size of the lung, that is the size of the hypopharynx.
Yes.
So doctor, maybe you can help us to understand this. Is it true that some persons suffering from COVID are actually treated in the prone position?
Absolutely.
Why is that?
It's a different scenario, but I mean, in any patients with pneumonia, and particularly with COVID, but we see it in any patients with pneumonia, when you turn them prone, it can help. The problem is if they have pneumonia, they have bad matching between the blood vessels going through the lungs and the air sacs. We saw the movie at the beginning where you saw the alveoli and you saw all those blood vessels surrounding the bunch of grapes. In people who have pneumonia, COVID, whatever, that matching is going to be very bad, and that's what leads to the worse oxygenation in those patients. If you flip those patients prone, some of them will show no improvement, but a substantial number of them, the matching will get better between the blood vessels and the air sacs. You can't predict ahead of time until you turn the patient prone. You're not going to know which ones are going to do better, but some of them do. And so this is why prone has been very valuable in patients with COVID, but that is in people with pneumonia. This does not apply to people with normal lungs. It's not happening.
So, Dr. Tobin, also a lot of people sleep in the prone position.
Yes.
Is that dangerous?
No, because again, for the average person, you have so much reserves. So I mean, for a drop of 24% for you, it's not going to have any impact because you have a huge amount of reserve. It's not going to matter. But if you have somebody who drops the lung volume by 24%, and then that person is going to have to cope with the knee on the neck and is going to have to cope with having the arms pushed up and being unable to move the left lung, then it's a whole different kettle of fish.
Thank you, doctor. So have we covered the third mechanism, the prone position?
Yes.
Then let's talk about the fourth one, which is the knee on the back, arm, or side.
Yes.
Now, if we bring to mind Mr. Chauvin's right knee on Mr. Floyd's back or left side, well, let me ask this, forget that question. Does it matter whether the right knee was on Mr. Floyd's back or left arm or his side?
No, it's really all amounting to the same, because we're talking again back to the bucket handle and the pump handle. So whether it's on the back or rammed in against the side and down on the arm, all of these are just going to markedly impair your ability to be able to move your chest with your bucket handle and your pump handle. You just can't do it. It's all rammed in. And what you have to, the whole time in this case, you have to constantly keep in mind that this is taking place on the street. The street is playing a huge part because it's coming in the front and totally preventing every action happening on the front.
And did that influence then Mr. Floyd's oxygen stores or reserves, the EELV?
Right, yes, they're going down. As a result of, once the ELV goes down, every proportional decrease you're seeing in the ELV, you're seeing the same proportional decrease in the oxygen stores.
And were you able to calculate what that influence was?
Yes.
I want to show you what's marked as Exhibit 932. And I ask you, Dr. Chauvin, does this reflect the calculations that you did?
Yes, this does. So now you see with the effect.
One moment,
I'm
Doctor.
sorry.
One moment.
Going off.
Your Honor,
I apologize.
I offer Exhibit 932.
Any objection? 932 is received.
Now, Doctor, please tell us what we see here in 932.
So what you're seeing here now is that now it's no longer just prone. Now you have the knee on the back in addition, or the knee on the side. And so this is going to further compress down the ELV. And so here you're seeing that the ELV has now been really squashed down. So it's by the combination of turning him prone and also having the knee on the back, you're seeing a 43% reduction in the ELV, which means that there's also a 43% reduction in his oxygen reserves, which means there is also a huge reduction in the size of the hypopharynx, because this is directly linked to the hypopharynx, and you will see how this is linked. And so when you decrease the size of the ELV, that's going to cause it. And then an additional effect is that your work of breathing goes up, because when you're turned prone and with the knee on the back, now the work that Mr. Floyd has to perform becomes huge, because he has to, with each breath, he has to try and fight against the street. He has to try that he has, and then he has to try and lift up the officer's knee with each breath, and also remember he has to try and also lift up the effect of the other officer pumping in his arm with the handcuffed arm. They're pushing it into his chest. So he has to make all these efforts to try and breathe against that.
So doctor, when you tell us about a 43% reduction, 24% of that is just being in the prone position.
Correct.
And the other 19% then is the contribution of the knee on the neck and back.
Yeah, exactly. The other 19% is, so 24% from being prone, another 19% coming from the knee on the back.
And just so we're clear for the jury, how does this again translate into difficulty in breathing?
So again, I did calculations of this, and basically you're looking at more than a threefold increase in the work of breathing in terms of just from the effect of nothing else. That's even leaving out the effect of the knee on the neck, just from looking at what's happening within the chest. So there's a huge increase in the work that Mr. Floyd was performing just to try and cope with what was happening below the neck, leaving aside what is happening above the neck.
Doctor, I want to show you exhibits 922 through 926. And after you have a chance to see them, I want you first just to identify just what you're seeing in those before we show it to the jury.
Yes, I identify.
Tell us, please, what it is for the record.
We're looking at the effect of the lungs on the hypopharynx, beginning with Mr. Floyd sitting on the sidewalk.
Your Honor, we offer exhibits 922 through 926.
Any objections? 922 through 926 inclusive are received.
So, doctor, if you will walk us through these to help us to understand the narrowing of the hypopharynx in the case of Mr. Floyd.
Right. Before you look at the hypopharynx, just look down at the lungs, and you see that the lungs, as you would expect, are expanding with each breath. You see the diaphragm going down. You can see the pump handle action. The lungs are getting bigger front to back. But then you see that exactly as the lungs are expanding, if you focus up in the yellow boxed area, and then the yellow boxed area is enlarged over on the right side. And you can see that as you inspire, the size of the hypopharynx is also enlarging. So you're seeing both of these happening. So it's the effect of the lung volume, how it influences the opening of the hypopharynx. And this is sitting on the sidewalk.
So looking at exhibit 922, what do we see here now in the prone position?
Right, so now we see Mr. Floyd after he's turned prone, and now we can see the lungs are smaller than they were because they fall, we know when you turn prone. And then you also see now that the area of the hypopharynx is further narrowed because the lungs, as they get smaller, they have less effect in keeping that open, and so that gets smaller.
Okay.
And then we have the knee on the back, and now we see with the knee on the back, then the lungs become further reduced, like I showed you for the precise calculations of the volumes. And now you see here is the size of the hypopharynx further is shrunk as a result of it. So the opening through the hypopharynx is impacted by the knee on the back.
And if we compare them all together, all three?
Right. So here you're seeing them all together. So on the left is sitting on the sidewalk, then just the effect of prone, and then the effect of prone with the back compression. And you can see the arrow is pointing out to you on the first one, where is the hypopharynx, right, that area, and with the epiglottis directly in front of it. And you can see that it's expanding when he's sitting down. And then when he's prone, and when he is prone with the back compression, you're seeing that the area that of expansion is getting smaller, as exactly as what you would expect to happen.
Going back to Mr. Floyd's lung volumes, Dr. Tobin, is there a point in time when you determined that Mr. Floyd did not have enough oxygen in his stores even to remain conscious?
Yes, there is.
And when was that?
The time in terms of the loss of consciousness was 24:53. We can tell it precisely in terms of where the absence of consciousness occurs.
And can you tell by facial features or anything?
You can tell, because I mean, this is something I do not as a physiologist, but as an ICU doctor. I mean, we're always looking at facial features to be able to tell how conscious somebody is. And we can tell by how you flick your eyes or how you move the muscles in your face. And that you'll be able to tell, is the person conscious or unconscious? It's a very important sign in patients as we're taking care of them, to be able to monitor that, and the primary way we monitor it is by inspecting it. So I would have done this millions of times.
And do you know, Dr. Tobin, what his oxygen level would have been at the time he went unconscious?
Yes, we also know that at the time, if you have somebody who is in the situation who is at risk of trouble with oxygen, we know that the moment at which you lose consciousness, the level of oxygen in your blood will be 36. That's the number that's associated based on very hard scientific data telling us that.
And again, the normal level of oxygen was?
In Mr. Floyd was 89 for him. In a 46-year-old man, you expect the normal level of oxygen is 89. The level at which you will have an absence of consciousness then will be 36.
Doctor, I want to show you exhibit 928. If we could clear the screen, Your Honor. And first, for the record, before we show this to the jury, can you just identify what is Exhibit 928?
We're looking at the effects on Mr. Floyd's oxygen as a result of all the various maneuvers that are being done to him.
Your Honor, I offer Exhibit 928.
Any objection? 928 is received.
So tell us, Dr. Tobin, what do we see here in Exhibit 928?
We're looking at, I mean, when it began, the level of oxygen, when I saw it, began with a level of oxygen of 89, and then we see that it falls down to 36. The slide is looking a bit different than what I saw before. Yep, so here you see that the level of oxygen beforehand, it's 89, and then at the point when we notice the lack of consciousness in his face, that the level of oxygen will drop down to 36.
One more advance, right?
And so that tells us there, it tells us the time for the loss of consciousness. And then we know that it continues from there, and where he, from the time that he stops breathing, which is 20:25:16, and then I calculated out that from there on, that you can calculate based on, again, very rigorous science, when the level of oxygen will have gone down to 0. But this first one, we're looking at the level, the loss of consciousness at 36, and that's happening at 20:24:53, and we're able to tell that by looking at his face.
And 20:24:53 is 8:24 p.m. and 53 seconds.
Correct.
Was there a point in time when Mr. Floyd no longer had any oxygen left in his body?
There is, because again, once he stops breathing at 20:25:16, then you can, it would take another 25 seconds for the level of oxygen to go down to 0. At that point, he wouldn't have an ounce of oxygen left in his entire body.
Doctor, I want to show you Exhibit 931.
Okay.
And ask you first if you would just tell us what it depicts before we show it to the jury.
Yes, that's showing exactly.
What do we see in 931?
So what we're seeing in 931 is that his level of oxygen has gone all the way down to 0.
All right. So we're going to show this to the jury, but first let me move to admit Exhibit 931.
Any objection? 931 is received.
Now, Dr. Tobin, would you explain to the jury what we see here in Exhibit 931?
Right. We're seeing that the level of oxygen has gone down to 0. That there is, at that point, there's not an ounce of oxygen left in his body. And again, this is totally, you can figure this out with very precise science, looking at once somebody stops breathing, what will be the rate of decline in the level of oxygen, how long it will take to reach 0. And this is, so we see here that he reaches a level of 0 of oxygen at 20:25:41. And so at that point, there's not an ounce of oxygen left in his body, in his entire body at 20:25:41.
And so was the knee then lifted off of his neck at the point there was no more oxygen in his body?
No, the knee remained on the neck for another 3 minutes and 2 seconds after we reached the point where there was not 1 ounce of oxygen left in the body.
Thank you, Doctor. Are you aware of studies suggesting that putting someone in the prone position and putting a weight on the back is not dangerous?
Yes, I'm aware of these studies. They largely come out from San Diego, from the group of Dr. Chan and Vilke and his colleagues.
Are you able to generally characterize the nature of these studies for the jury?
The bottom line is they're highly misleading.
Are they relevant to the analysis you've just given to the jury this morning?
No, they're not relevant to the analysis we gone through this morning.
Help us to understand why.
Okay? The problem is in these particular studies, and there's, I mean, I don't know how many in total, but could be close to 10 of them, and where they take people, first of all, they take perfectly healthy volunteers, they bring them into the physiology lab, and they lay them flat and they put a mat underneath them, which is different than the street. And then they put weights on top of them, so that weights could be lead weight in bags, or else in many of them they use kind of the barbells that you see in a gym, like an Olympic wheel that you'd see in a gym for weightlifting, and they place those on the back of the subjects, and then they measure various lung volumes. So typically they'll measure what we call vital capacity or maximum voluntary ventilation. These are specific types of lung function tests that you don't need to bother with, but they're showing a decrease in lung availability of around 35%. That's a substantial decrease in your lung volumes that you're finding. And then they conclude in virtually all of their studies that that level of decrease in lung volume doesn't matter because there's no change in the level of oxygen. And so therefore it's not clinically relevant. The problem is, in doing a study like that, oxygen is the exact wrong yardstick to be using in a study like this. What they needed to do is continue to measure out the changes in lung volume like the ELV, showing what happens to this. Oxygen will only fall at the very end. It's an extremely insensitive measure. It's very important, but it's very insensitive to know if stuff is going bad inside the body. It's going to be a very late event. And so for their concluding of this,
Let's have another question.
I didn't
Question,
hear
please.
Objection, Your Honor. Should I interpose another question? Please. Right, Your Honor. So to help us to better understand Dr. Chauvin, are these studies measuring the diminution or decrease in the oxygen reserve, the EELV?
no, they're not.
I want to show you what's marked as Exhibit 948. And does Exhibit 948 point to one of the studies that you were referring to?
Yes, it does.
Would it be helpful to use this slide to explain your testimony?
Yes, it would.
Your Honor, we would offer Exhibit 948.
Any objection? 948 is received.
So looking here at this slide, Dr. Chauvin, what does this tell us in terms of, for example, the surface area that's involved of the weight on the back?
So if you look at the subject's back, you can see here that there are 4 weights out of a gym that are placed on the back of the subject. And the big wheel out of the plate, out of an Olympic plate, is going to have a diameter of 17.5 inches. And so you can measure the cross-sectional area of that is going to be 240 square inches. The trouble is that when officers kneel on the back of a suspect, they don't place an Olympic wheel on their back, they place their knee. And so the cross-sectional area of the knee is 24 square inches, which is 1/10 of the area of the big bell that you're looking at here. And so we know from simple physics that pressure is force over area. So that's 240 divided by 24. That tells you that the pressure being exerted on the back is 10 times more than what the San Diego people are claiming. They're off by a factor of 10.
So the pressure then being exerted by a knee is 10 times greater, is what you're saying?
Is 10 times greater than is going to be affected by the bell here that's shown from out of the gym, the bar that you're living.
Do any of these studies, doctor, involve a knee on the neck?
Nobody has done any studies involving the knee on the neck. I suspect you'd have major trouble getting that through the ethics committee in any medical school.
Do any of these studies go on for 9 minutes and 29 seconds?
No, they're all very brief studies.
So, doctor, have we now covered the four mechanisms that resulted in Mr. Floyd's shallow breathing and the reduction of the hypopharynx?
Yes, we have.
Now, Dr. Tobin, were or are you aware that Mr. Floyd had some pre-existing health conditions?
Yes, I am.
And how are you aware of that?
I mean, I read them in the records from Hennepin County, and obviously also saw them mentioned in the autopsy.
Do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether a person who had none of those pre-existing health conditions, a healthy person, would have died under the same circumstances as Mr. Floyd?
Yes, a healthy person subjected to what Mr. Floyd was subjected to would have died as a result of what he was subjected to.
Are you also aware that Mr. Floyd was found to have a type of tumor known as a paraganglioma?
Yes, I am.
And for the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what is a paraganglioma?
A paraganglioma is a type of a tumor that is found in the paraganglions, kind of sometimes in the pelvis. And
Is the finding of a paraganglioma significant to you as relates to Mr. Floyd and his death?
no, because one of the key things about a paraganglioma is that it's called the 10% tumor, which means that 10% of people who have a paraganglioma secrete adrenaline. Well, that could be important, but 90% of them don't secrete adrenaline. So you don't, 9 out of 10 of the times that you have a paraganglioma, you have no increase in the amount of adrenaline.
So if somebody were to die from a tumor, from some effect of a paraganglioma, would it be a sudden death?
Yes, there's been 6 reported cases of people who have had paragangliomas who have died suddenly. Well, that's the total in the literature, 6. And those people who died have headaches. And Mr. Floyd complained of a lot of pain in lots of different regions while he's down on the street, but he did not complain of headaches.
So in terms of reported cases where people have died from paragangliomas over the entire world, you know of 6 reported cases.
Yes,
And all of those are sudden deaths.
correct.
Did Mr. Floyd die a sudden death?
No.
I want to talk to you about a different subject. The jurors may have heard one of the officers say, if you can speak, you can breathe.
Yes.
Is that a true statement?
It's a true statement, but it gives you an enormous false sense of security. Certainly at the moment that you are speaking, you are breathing, but it doesn't tell you that you're going to be breathing 5 seconds later.
So let's talk about kind of why this is significant. So could you tell us about something that may seem obvious, that is, what's required for speaking?
Right. So I mean, for speaking, you only speak when you're exhaling. You have to blow air out, and then you vibrate the vocal cords. And that's all there is to speech. So it's air going across the vocal cords, they vibrate, and you speak. But to speak, there's 2 things important. One is you cannot blow air out if you didn't take a breath in beforehand. So you must have had an inspiration in to speak. The second thing is you cannot speak if your brain is not alert. Okay, so when you see somebody speaking, you know they have had an inspiration momentarily before they're speaking, and that there is oxygen going to the brain at the time that they are speaking.
And by inspiration, you mean that it had to take a breath in directly before
Right.
they're speaking.
Yeah.
Was the timing of Mr. Floyd's speech during the restraint important to your analysis?
Yes, it was.
Why so?
Because it tells us that for the time that he's speaking, and he continues to speak for 4 minutes 51 seconds from the time the knee is placed on his neck, it tells us that there could not have been complete compression, could not have been total occlusion of the neck at that time, for that time, because he's continuing to speak for 4 minutes 51 seconds.
Dr. Tobin, is the brain sensitive to oxygen deprivation?
The brain is the most sensitive area to needing oxygen.
So what percentage is the brain of body weight, and how much oxygen does it consume?
So the brain is relatively small. It's only 2% of our body weight, but it takes in 20% of all the oxygen that we take in. So the brain eats up oxygen at 10 times the normal level. It needs a huge amount of oxygen because it's sending out millions of nerve signals every second. So it needs a very high supply of oxygen.
Then how long can the brain go without oxygen?
That's well worked out. If you stop the flow of oxygen to the brain, you lose consciousness in 8 seconds.
So if you might recall Mr. Floyd's last words, I can't breathe.
Right.
Are those words significant to you as a pulmonologist?
Yes, obviously they're important different ways. One, he's complaining to you of difficulty with breathing, but they're also telling me that at that time when he's saying, please, I can't breathe, we know at that point he has oxygen in his brain. And again, it's a perfect example of how it gives you a huge false sense of security, because very shortly after that we're going to see that he has a major loss of oxygen in the way that he moves his leg. And so it tells you how dangerous is the concept of if you can breathe or if you can speak, you can breathe. Yes, that is true on the surface, but highly misleading. A very dangerous mantra to have out there.
So that if I'm hearing you correctly, when he says I can't breathe, that shows his brain is alert.
Yes.
But then immediately thereafter, his brain wasn't.
Correct.
And did you see, or is there anything in the video that you can show the jurors that they can see also that would point to the fact that his brain was no longer alert?
Yes.
Let me pull up Exhibit 47, already in evidence, at 2024. So I'm going to play a clip for you, Dr. Tobin, and then tell the jurors what they see afterwards.
Yes. So there's a key finding that you're seeing here, and that is when you see his leg going up. And you have to keep in mind he's prone, so he's facing down. So this is his leg coming up backwards. And so that's what we call as clinicians, that's an extension movement of the leg. And that is something we see when somebody suffers major brain lack of oxygen. And it tells us at that point he's having what are sometimes called a myoclonic seizure, sometimes called a hypoxic seizure. There's different terms that are used, but really they all amount to saying that you're seeing here fatal injury to the brain from a lack of oxygen.
It's sometimes also called an anoxic seizure.
It has all of these different words. There's a lot of different words that are used, but they all come down to the same thing, that it is that at that point the brain is responding to the drastically low level of oxygen that's present.
And does the fact of an anoxic seizure reflect damage to the brain?
It indicates severe damage to the brain.
And the reflex that we saw with the legs coming up, is that an involuntary reaction?
It's an involuntary reaction. I mean, there's a lot of different medical terms that we apply to it, but the bottom line is that you're seeing that the leg jumps up like that as a result of a fatally low level of oxygen going to the brain.
So, doctor, we talked about the brain injury. We also told us earlier about low levels of oxygen potentially causing pulseless electrical activity.
Yes.
And is that also then evidence of low oxygen?
Right. So I mean, when you have a low level of oxygen, that's going to show up in the brain, and it's also going to show up in the heart. And when it shows up in the heart, it's going to cause the heart to beat abnormally. And the particular way that it happened in Mr. Floyd was he developed a particular arrhythmia called a PEA, which is a pulsus electrical activity, where we're seeing there's electricity in the heart, but it's not resulting in any mechanical force. And so that's why it has that name. And so it's the low level of oxygen is producing both. We don't see the PEA, the pulses electrical activity arrhythmia, until that's shown up on the EKG in the ambulance. So it's much later that we see the evidence of it in terms of display. But here we're seeing huge evidence in terms of the leg. The leg is crucial here, because this is the time that the first time you're seeing there is major league oxygen damage.
So we reach a point where Mr. Floyd couldn't speak due to low oxygen. Was there any correlation also to a narrowing of the airways that prevented his being able to speak?
Yes, as well.
I want to show you what's marked as exhibits 934, 936, and 933. And just tell us, what are these images in general?
So we're seeing again the same MRI, but at a different view of it that we looked at before.
Your Honor, I offer exhibits 934, 936, and 933.
934, 936, and 933 are received.
So, Doctor, tell us what we see here, starting with the first.
Right. So
one.
this is the same MRI that you saw before, but what your attention is drawn to by the yellow arrow is the vocal cords, and the vocal cords is simply how you speak. So to speak, you must inhale, you must take air into your lungs, and then when you let the air out, you're going to vibrate those little vocal cords there, and that's what makes the sound of speech. And so here we see the size of the windpipe, the trachea, and this becomes important in terms of speech, because our knowledge about the influence of the size of the trachea, of the windpipe for speech, is from patients who had an endotracheal tube in place, and then they developed scarring after that. And so as a result of the scarring, we know what is the point at how much scarring in your windpipe will prevent you from speaking. And so these are just the dimensions, so as you know what is the size of the normal trachea. It's between a quarter and a dime, as you can see here, in terms of the diameters.
And then next slide, Brett.
And here is when those coins have been shrunk to 15%. And even when the trachea has narrowed all the way down to 15%, you are still able to speak. Even when the hole through your windpipe is just this size, as I've shown here, where I've shrunk the size of the coins, you are still able to speak. So it tells you how dangerous it is to think, well, if he can speak, he's doing okay, because at this point you will be able to speak. But again, if there is a small increase in the amount of narrowing here, not only will you not be able to speak, you won't be able to breathe, you won't be able to live. And so it's a very dangerous thing to think that because you're able to speak, you're doing okay.
And so, Doctor, you're not able to speak, breathe, or live once the airway narrows to below 15%.
Correct. Once you'll go from the 15%, you'll still be able to speak, and then as it gets lower from that, initially you'll be struggling, and then at some stage you just won't be able to do anything.
Brett, if we could show exhibit 940, it's already admitted.
So again, this is exactly, because this is the same experiment I showed you before. And it just so happens, this is pure coincidence. It's at 85%. You're looking at that top curve, and that's the same number that we showed you on the MRI. This is pure coincidence. But you can see here, once you're up at 85%, that the work of breathing is enormous. It's 7.5-fold increase. And then as that narrowing would get further and further, then the work would become unbearable. So again, it just emphasizes at the point where you can't speak and you are in deep trouble.
Doctor, I'd like to transition now from talking about the physiology of breathing to talk about your work as a clinician, taking care of patients with respiratory troubles. Does that experience factor into your opinions today also?
Yes.
Did you do anything to try to understand Mr. Floyd's actual rate of breathing?
Yes, I did.
Why was that important to do?
Because a major part of my work as a lung specialist is looking at people's breathing. You get an awful lot of information by looking at how they breathe, by looking at how they use their chest wall. All of this is extremely informative. And at the lowest level, one of the simplest things to do that is especially informative is simply to count how many breaths somebody takes in. It's one of the vital signs, like with blood pressure, pulse rate, temperature, is the respiratory rate. It's one of the signs that tells us, and it gives us a lot of clues as to what is happening inside the body.
Is this something you've done before?
I've done it millions of times.
Do you train others in how to do it?
And I've trained nurses, respiratory therapists, medical students, doctors in how to do it.
And so you're accounting the breaths. Do you observe the muscles and things also?
You separately from counting the breaths, you're going to look at the different muscles they're using, whether they're using their sternomastoid, what type of bucket handle action they have, what type of pump handle. You're looking at all of this in a glance. I mean, with somebody as old as me, I can see all of this very rapidly.
So did you take this clinical experience and apply it to your observations of Mr. Floyd's breathing, in this case on the videos?
Yes, I did.
Was there video evidence from which you could take measurements?
Yes, there is.
I want to show Exhibit 43 that's already in evidence. So I want to play this, doctor, and afterward tell us what we're seeing. So in a moment it will start.
So if you focus down here on where the handcuff is and where his arm is close to his black shirt is the best place to see. And you can count out his respiratory rate. So you're seeing that he's making a respiratory rate here, then another. And so we need to play it back, because I needed to tell you first where to focus. If you focus down there, you will be able to count out the rates.
All right, we will play it once more so that you can count the rates so the jurors see what you're referring to.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
So that was roughly a 17-second clip,
Right?
and you counted 7 or 8 breaths.
Between 7 and 8. Yeah.
And did you use this to calculate a rate of respiration?
Yes, because I mean it's simple. Once you have 19 seconds and you count out the number of breaths you have here, and if it say you count out 7 breaths, that will come out at a respiratory rate of 22.
Is that number, the respiratory rate of 22, significant to this case?
It's extremely significant,
Why is that?
because one of the things in this case is the question of fentanyl. And if fentanyl is having an effect and is causing depression of the respiratory centers, the centers that control breathing, that's going to result in a decrease in the respiratory rate. And it's shown that with fentanyl you expect a 40% reduction in the respiratory rate. So with fentanyl his respiratory rate should be down at around 10. Instead of that, it's right in the middle of normal at 22.
So you didn't see a depressed rate of respiration or breathing rate in Mr. Floyd?
No, it's normal.
And so what does it tell you, bottom line, with respect to fentanyl as relates to Mr. Floyd?
Exactly. In terms of fentanyl, one of the major changes you see in fentanyl is a slowing of the respiratory rate. So, and again, we would be expecting a 40% reduction in the respiratory rate with fentanyl. The normal respiratory rate is 17 breaths per minute, plus or minus 5. So that would mean a normal respiratory rate of between 12 and 22. That's the normal range of respiratory rate. And so if it was with fentanyl, you'd be expecting a respiratory rate of 10. Instead of that, you count it here yourself. And you can see when you count it yourself that the respiratory rate is 22. So basically it tells you there isn't fentanyl on board. That is affecting his respiratory centers. It's not having an effect on his respiratory centers.
So Mr. Floyd's respiratory rate was normal at 22 just before he lost consciousness?
Correct.
So the jury may have heard some other information in the case about the fentanyl related to an elevated carbon dioxide level in Mr. Floyd's body in the emergency room. Was that significant to you?
Yes, that's very significant as well.
How so?
Because he's reported to have a PCO2, sorry, I take it back. He's reported to have a carbon dioxide level in the arterial blood in the emergency room of 89. That's a very high level of carbon dioxide. And so you have to take into account what are the factors that might have led to that. And there's particularly important factors in Mr. Floyd to explain why his carbon dioxide was found at 89 in the emergency room.
So, doctor, would you first tell us what would normal have been for carbon dioxide levels?
The normal carbon dioxide level in you or me is 35 to 45 millimeters of mercury. That's the norm. You don't need the millimeters of mercury stuff, but they're the units that are given in the hospital chart.
So you said that there were significant factors in the case of Mr. Floyd. Would you help the jury understand what those were?
Yes, the important factors are that we know that he made his own last spontaneous effort to breathe at 20:25:16. After that, you can look at the videos and you see he makes no effort to breathe. He makes no breath. The last breath he took was at 20:25:16. Then we know after that he stayed on the street for another 3 minutes or so. Then he's placed into the ambulance, and we know that in the ambulance they attempted to put in an airway, an eye gel, and you can see that on the Officer Lane's body cam. You can see all of that happening, and then you can see the time at which they actually successfully inserted the airway and when they gave him the first breath. And that is a gap of 9 minutes and 50 seconds from when he last took a breath.
And why is that significant?
That's very significant because we can calculate what is the rate of increase in the carbon dioxide in somebody who doesn't breathe. If somebody doesn't take a breath, carbon dioxide increases at a predictable rate. And that rate is up to 4.9 millimeters of mercury per minute that it increases. And so he has not taken a breath for 9 minutes and 50 seconds. So you would expect, just on that basis, that his carbon dioxide level will go up by 49. So you add 49 to the normal values, of 35 to 45, and then you add that and you're going to get a value of between 89 and above, and so it comes out virtually identical to the value that they found in the emergency room of 89.
So doctor, what's the punchline with respect to that? What does it tell us?
The significance of all of that is it's a second reason why you know fentanyl is not causing the depression of his respiration. What you're seeing is that the increase in his carbon dioxide that is found in the emergency room is solely explained by what you expect to happen in somebody who doesn't have any ventilation given to him for 9 minutes and 50 seconds. It's completely explained by that.
So when a person then is not breathing, then carbon dioxide would naturally continue to build up in the body.
Yes.
And that's what matches what was seen in the OR for Mr. Floyd.
Precisely.
Now you said that there were other things that were significant that were related to the rate of respiration, and we talked about fentanyl.
Right.
Was there anything else?
Yes. The other things, there's two other things that are very important to the respiratory rate, because you saw it with your own eyes, exactly his respiratory rate. And the first thing is that if you have somebody who has underlying heart disease, and the heart disease is so severe that it's been said that it's causing shortness of breath, that it's causing you difficulty with breathing. If somebody has heart disease that's causing shortness of breath, virtually all of those patients are going to have very high respiratory rates. They're going to have respiratory rates of 30, over 30, even over 40. When you have heart disease, that'll give you shortness of breath. Instead of that, we find that his respiratory rate is normal at 22. The second thing that's important about the respiratory rate of 22 is if you have somebody where the primary problem in the body is airway narrowing, where you have somebody where there is that the airways are being compressed, there's narrowing in the neck, or there's narrowing like in somebody in the chest, what the response, the physiological response to airway narrowing is a normal respiratory rate. And that is what he has. So it's but the respiratory rate that you see that's normal is the expected physiological response in somebody who has airway narrowing.
So doctor, we've covered the mechanisms of how low oxygen occurs. As a clinician, did you observe the results of low oxygen in the video showing the last minutes of George Floyd's life?
Yes.
What did you observe?
I mean, in terms of what we're seeing is the changes in his facial appearance. This becomes crucially important, again, in seeing the effects of the low oxygen.
And have you seen this effect in other patients as a clinician?
Yes, I mean, because I work in an ICU where 40% of our patients die, so I'm extremely familiar with seeing people who die, unfortunately. And so when you see these changes, you see the changes in the face. It is the key way of noticing something happening is by looking at the effects on the face.
Doctor, I'm going to show you Exhibit 15 already admitted into evidence at 404, and I want to play a clip and have you tell us what it shows.
At the beginning, you can see he's conscious. You can see slight flickering, and then it disappears.
And
so one second he's alive, and 1 second he's no longer.
And could we just once more, in case Brenda went pretty fast, so jurors can see it. just 1 second. It is 202453 in the composite. Yeah, and the speed is slowed down by a third, just so we can see it. Is that the flicking
Yes,
you referred to?
you can see his eyes, he's conscious, and then you see that he isn't. That's the moment the life goes out of his body.
I want to also show you a clip from another body-worn camera, Exhibit 43. And for Mr. Nelson, that's the Kane one. 22. That's where it starts. And I want to play this for you also, Dr. Tobin, and you could tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what this informs us.
Dr. Tobin,
Yeah.
my stomach hurts. My neck hurts. Everything hurts.
So now he's rocking his right side. You can see how he's moving his hip to try and rock the right side of his body to try and get air. You can see him again pushing down on the street to get air in. And these movements of his hip you may miss, but he's having to use all his entire spine to just try and get air into that right side of the body. Keep in mind the left side is non-functional from the way they have manipulated him and pushed him into the street. So he's cranking up his right side of his body, you can see it right there, to try and get some air into his right side of his chest. He's making repeated struggling movements. He's moving again the hips because he's using his spine to try and get those muscles to move air into the right side of his chest. And he's again trying to use his right arm, and he's unable because of the chain, the small chain linking it over to the left side. He's trying to have pushed down on that right arm into the street to try and help him, but he's unable to do it because of the chain on the handcuffs.
And at some point, Mr. Floyd stops speaking, and what does that tell us about his oxygen supply?
That tells us at that point where he's not speaking, it tells us that the airway narrowing in his upper airway is more than 85%, and then it's separate from in terms of the oxygen level. That we're seeing by the face, but they're all happening together. And so once we see the lack of speech, we're seeing how much narrowing there is in the airway, but they're all happening, they're all coming in together.
And then did the restraint stop
Right.
at the time of the brain injury and the PEA arrhythmia?
Yes.
The restraint stopped at that time?
No, the restraints continued after that. He has the cessation of respiratory efforts. When he last take a breath, the knee remains on the neck for another 3 minutes and 27 seconds after he takes his last breath. There's the knee remains. After there's no pulse, the knee remains on the neck for another 2 minutes and 44 seconds. After the officers have found themselves there's no pulse, the knee remains on the neck another 2 minutes 44 seconds.
Thank you, Dr. Tobin. No further questions.
Okay.
Mr. Nelson. Side break. Members of the jury, we're going to take our lunch break at this time. We're going to take until 1:30. Thank you.